Good morning. All right, I think we're about ready to start. Thanks to Rod for agreeing to moderate our discussion again.
Well, welcome everyone, and let's open with the prayer. Eternal God, who led your ancient people into freedom by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, grant that we who walk in the light of your presence may rejoice in the liberty of the children of God. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
So, carrying on, if we recall last time, the Israelis are slaves in Egypt. Moses goes down. Pharaoh has a hard heart and will not let them go. And we go through the 10 plagues. And then we ultimately, Pharaoh agrees to let them go. But before, the last plague is the killing of all of the firstborn, and at the same time, Passover. So they are all instructed to prepare their meal and be prepared to go. And that's kind of where we ended up the last time.
Right. Cliffhanger, right?
Right, yeah.
So here we are, they're ready to go. So on the board, I've drawn a couple of things that I found interesting when I was preparing for this. One is a timeline about what transpires here. And it took them 47 days to go from Goshen, which was where they were in Egypt, to Mount Sinai. So think about this, there's 9 million, there's 2 million people moving. And they were averaging about 9 miles a day, approximately. But they could also go at night because there was a pillar of fire in front of them. They spent a year at Mount Sinai. They spent another year at Kadesh, which is about right here. And then they spent 38 years in Kadesh Barnea, which is where Petra is in Jordan.
Who is that?
We'll talk about that. So it's about 494 miles from Goshen to Mount Sinai, where they spent a year. It was 230 miles, 34 miles up here. As a point of interest, it was 473 miles that they had gone directly to Canaan. However, God knew they were not prepared to go. They were, I made a point of this last time, they had a slave mentality. They were not self-reliant, and they were not prepared to defend themselves. So they certainly weren't prepared to take on the Philistines, who would have protected the land. So that kind of gives you timeline and a little map. You'll have to pardon my bad art, but so Dave, you want to take us on then?
Sure, we start by kind of giving a narrative overview of the chapter that we have just read. And so we are now on chapter 6, the waters were divided. And so what I invite you all to do is to tell the story of chapter 6. We're not doing a deep dive yet. This is more just like, what were the events that were covered in chapter 6?
I just say, if anyone wants a copy of the path, if you forgot yours, there are like 4 or 5 in that bookcase right there.
Great.
Can you hear?
All right. What happened in chapter 6?
Pharaoh let the Israelites go. And so they started their trek to the land of milk and honey. And this was after all the plagues that God sent to Pharaoh and his people. So on the journey, the Israelites wanted this, wanted that, complained and saw miracles and still didn't believe in God, or would forget about the miracles or something. And so they complained the whole way. But But then, it was a lot went on during that journey. And when they got to the land, God got, Moses up on the mountain to see the promised land, but he wouldn't let him go over there. So, he let him just lay down and die. And it passed to Joshua to lead him over.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's.
You got it.
We'll get a cup of coffee.
Recording in progress.
Thing that I was struck by is that the Jews lured the Egyptians into the Red Sea after parted and let God just beat the fool out of the Egyptians.
And I'm the only one that went through childhood, with the Red Sea that they parted.
Yes.
Penny, could we get you to mute your computer? I think it's causing some feedback.
You're on 2 devices.
Oh, you're on 2 devices.
I'll turn off. Give it to you.
If you could.
Actually, I think it's a sea of reeds, right?
Mute. Okay, that ought to. Okay, I
Lesser
think we're good now.
better
Thank you,
ways.
Penny.
It's a long way from Red Sea.
What were you saying, John?
My resource information, which is largely Rose's pictorial book, is that it's the lesser and greater bitter seas, which is the very north end of the Red Sea. Much shallower, much narrower, and therefore much easier to get across. Story's not as good as the Red Sea, but
It's still a good story.
Yeah.
Well, I kind of saw one reference in here. I'm trying to find it now, it's talking about the River Nile. Really kind of, it was strange.
Does it matter?
Well, the Nile isn't quite as far across as the Red Sea, you know. And you need to cross in the water. Gosh.
I don't think there's certainty what the body of water was. Some have translated it as the Reed Sea. I think so. But it's interesting what you alluded to, John. You talked, or whoever it was that talked about kind of what we thought of as a child.
Yeah. Wilson.
Most of us, I think, or I do, have embedded in my brain Charlton Heston.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, so these are some of the things that we have to kind of remember as we read these stories, that the way we view them is colored by some of the things we've seen, some of the images, artwork, other things that we've read. But it's hard for me to read any of this stuff
Yeah.
without playing Cecil B. DeMille in my head.
If I like simple, so if we look at the story as revelation and affirming that that's the main part, there are 3 things, like Aaron said, there's the escape from Egypt, there's the journey in the wilderness, and then there's Mount Sinai. And that's pretty packed for a book of the Bible with that many major events.
Yeah. Any other, just as in terms of events that we've covered, what else would y'all like to fill in? Wilson?
They make a point in here about the Song of Miriam retelling this adventure and the fact that it was something they all needed to celebrate. And I've always, EFMers are probably have heard this before, but that's the first really epic poem in the entire literature. It's some 600 years before the Iliad and the Odyssey, and yet these epic poems that are reported and celebrated and transmitted orally become a way of defining who you are, and this is an important event. And then, I mean, there's the chorus and then there's the narrator, and you can tell this was a big stage production with and the symbols and the dancing and everything. And I like the way it's portrayed in the prayer book, because you start off with the 3 songs of Isaiah, and then you have the Magnificat. But the first one in there is called the Song of Moses, and I think that's wrong. I think it's a song of Miriam about Moses. But, and then the other beautiful place where the poetry tries to tell this story is in Psalm 78. And it's almost a beautiful retelling of the crossing of the Red Sea. So
Actually, an interesting thing about the Song of Miriam is it about 75% of it is about the them being saved, crossing and celebrating that event. And the last 25% is about prophecy, about the fact that they will get to the land of milk and honey. So it's kind of an interesting ending that they're singing at this time. So.
And she's called a prophet.
Right.
Uh-huh.
Prophets in the Testament. So.
One other thing from a narrative standpoint that I'll point out, and Rod kind of noted this as we were discussing this, the focus is on Exodus, but at the end it jumps to Deuteronomy, jumps straight over 2 books of the Bible. So Leviticus and Numbers are both, and this is the nature of this book. This is a Cliff Notes version that focuses on some of the major events in the Bible, but just want to point out that we have skipped over 2 whole books, which we don't hear too much about. They don't appear a great deal in our lectionary, especially Leviticus, which is really a kind of a priest's manual. And well, there's almost no Deuteronomy. That's
Yeah.
right. Yeah. We jump straight to the end of Deuteronomy, don't we? So those are important books.
I was struck by the retelling of the 10 Commandments and about Moses going up the mountain and bringing back down, and folks had gone haywire, so he smashed them on the rocks, but he went back. But he not only got the 10 Commandments, he got the other laws, and that was striking to me. I thought that the Jewish people just developed those on their own, but no, there was the whole litany of other rules.
That was news to me too. I agree. I didn't realize there were laws other than the 10 Commandments. So I read this very book.
So let's talk about cover, because as you said, we're going to cover more than Exodus. We're talking about Exodus, which is the travel, the experiences, Mount Sinai, the 10 Commandments. Leviticus, as Dave said, is really instructions to priests and how you sacrifice and the formality of how the priests conduct themselves, and in particularly in the tabernacle. Numbers is what I call let's get organized book, because they've got the 12 tribes. They got all these people. They're now assigning them tasks and areas where they camp, because the tabernacle is in the center of the thing, but they took a census, and they're trying to, you can imagine with that number of people, they had to get organized to be able to operate. And then Deuteronomy is called the second law. It fundamentally retells the story of Moses, the 10 Commandments again, right up until the time they get to the Jordan River. And I found it interesting that only 2 men, which does not count the women and children, only 2 men that came out of Egypt were allowed to enter Canaan. That was Joshua and Caleb, because they were the only ones that showed faith, because there were 2 attempts to go in, but we'll get to that.
I say real quick about Numbers. The ancient Hebrew title of that book was Bidmidbar, which means in the wilderness. So the titles of these books kind of changes how we think about them. So Numbers does focus on kind of the journey from Sinai to the Jordan. And Deuteronomy, in addition to being sort of a retelling of the law, is intended to give some specificity to it. Like, this is the law that you were given in a kind of a general way, thou shalt not kill. You're about to cross into the promised land. Here's what it's going to look like to live that out in the land that you're coming into.
So we're gonna go back to the Red Sea or the Sea of Reeds or wherever we are, but if we remember from last time, this is a book of remembrance. And there's also, I'd like for y'all to think about the connections between Exodus or the Old Testament and the New Testament, because there's quite a few. So for example, I was sitting in the Christmas service and Dave talked about the angel of the Lord was over Jesus at the birth. So we have the angel of the Lord in a cloud leading the Israelis out of Egypt. So it's kind of interesting that Moses has all this responsibility. He's done all these things, and he's the guy that remembers to go get Joseph's bones because they had made a pledge to do that. So here he's leading 2 million people, and he's the guy that says we got to bring them with us, right? Thought that was kind of it's a little detail. So it took these Israelites about 3 days after they had seen Pharaoh's army destroyed. They had seen the 10 plagues and everything they had seen and God had done for them to start grumbling. They were hungry, they were thirsty, and so forth. And so as we know that they're complaining, they're saying, weren't there enough graves in Egypt for us? Couldn't we have died someplace beside in the desert? And Moses says, stand firm. I love that. Trust in the Lord. So he obviously delivers the manna to feed them every day and gives them specific instructions that 6 days they gather. On the 6th day, they gather twice as much because they cannot gather on the 7th day, the Sabbath. Okay, that was we're going to see the Sabbath a lot mentioned here in Exodus about the importance of it. We talked about the Song of Miriam. So he's provided food for them, the manna and then they complain because they don't have any meat. So he has to give them the quail as well. So then he makes a pledge to them, he being God, through Moses. If you listen carefully to the Lord your God and do right and keep his commands, God will not bring on you any diseases and any trouble. He will protect you if you follow carefully what the Lord had told them to do. So that's to me, a very significant point based on what transpires later. This is a discussion, not a lecture. So y'all please jump in at any time.
You know how much is in an homer?
There is a measurement in my footnote, but I can't remember what it is.
3.5 to 4 pounds
Thank you.
per person.
All right, that's a lot.
Wow.
But they were also exercising, they were walking. So they were burning a lot of calories, if you will. That's a lot though. So he told them to rest. We'll talk about rest on the Sabbath shortly. But here's a connection. In John 6, Jesus compares himself to the manna and the bread. I thought that was kind of an interesting little connection. I love those little things. They ate it for 40 years. The entire time they were on their journey, and when they were parked up in Kadesh Barnea, which I think I'm pronouncing correctly, they were for 38 years they had it.
Well, it's hard to be grateful when you're miserable. Can you imagine eating the same thing every single day, month, year after year? And if there's sand in your tent, I mean, it's fun. And it's hard to say, well, thank you, God. You know, that really struck me. I mean, they were awful, but then I don't thank God when I'm miserable sometimes.
That's a good point.
That was good.
If they had an alternative to you, then,
That, yeah, but then.
decision.
So you have to kind of think of part of the things that's going on here, and this trick is God is testing them. He's trying to get them to be self-reliant and to be able to take care of themselves. But then they complain because they don't have water, and they come to a place called Menasha and Merabai.
Maribon.
Yeah, where they're complaining about the water and the God provides the water. And the meaning of these words is test and quarrel. They were testing quarreling with God, and he wasn't happy about it, right? Joshua becomes mentioned early in this event because he was the one that led the Israelis against the Alchemalites when they had a small battle, which they won. Then we come to Jethro, who was Moses's father-in-law. He was a Mennonite. He was not an Israelite. And I'm not using the term Jew here because we really hadn't got to Jewish time yet. But Moses meets up with Jethro. He explains all that's transpired. And so Jethro recognized the power of God, but he also is watching Moses and how he interacts with the people. And he says, you got a problem. I mean, you cannot handle all these people. You're gonna have to get some judges or leaders in here to lead the thousands, the hundreds, the 50s, and so forth. So Jethro was a key person in helping him kind of get some structure to this vast number of people that were going on.
I thought it was strange that he doesn't mention Moses' wife.
Actually, he did. In Exodus, they mentioned it because he was reunited with his wife and his two sons whenever Jethro came, because they had been with Jethro. What's her name?
Zipporah.
Yeah, Zipporah. So good point, Bob. So they trek to Mount Sinai, which is a mountain, and some people think it's was a volcano or whatever. And Moses goes up the mountain after they've been there like 3 days. And also there's some elders, but other people are told to sit at the foot of the mountain, not to come on the mountain. It's the elders, Aaron and Moses. And
Early vestry,
excuse me, I'm sorry.
early vestry.
Right, exactly. So the law, the 10 Commandments are delivered to Moses. He speaks the commandments to them. He speaks the commandments. And they can see what's going on. They can't necessarily hear. I think maybe the elders might have been able to hear. I don't know. There's a lot of conflicting information, but the point is that God spoke the law to them, to Moses, and he tells Moses to get the people's agreement, which is kind of interesting. So Moses goes down and he tells the people what's going on. And he says, if you obey me and keep my covenants, then I will take care of you and you will be a holy nation. Okay. The people agree. They said, yes, we will do this. And then Moses goes back up the mountain and he's up there for like 6 days. And then he goes into this dense cloud where he remains for 40 days. So when he comes down with the 10 Commandments. Additionally, who was it brought up the point about the other laws? He got the other laws, and the instructions for the tabernacle. So he came down with a lot. So in the meantime, his crew downstairs has fallen off the wagon again, and they want an idol, and they build this calf, and God tells Moses he better go down and sort this out. And he's angry, and Moses goes down and breaks the tablets and tells the people that they're terrible and so forth. And then
Mel Brooks, you remember Mel Brooks?
yeah.
Hey,
Yeah. So he instructs the Levites, who are the priestly tribe, to go out, and they kill like 3,000 people, right? They melt the calf into water and make all the people drink the water. And the people object to, I mean, they're all remorseful and so forth. But here was something I learned in this. This event. I'm skipped a part. When he spoke the law, when he gave the law to the Israelites, is celebrated as the Festival of Weeks, which we call Pentecost. It's 50 days after Passover. And I didn't know that my own self. Anybody got any comments on that? That's a great connection. You're given the law on the Festival of Weeks, which we celebrate as Pentecost, and we celebrate the fact the Holy Spirit was breathed on us at Pentecost. I thought it was a great connection to me. Anybody got any comments on that?
Well, I had a comment about the people after Moses comes down with the 2 tablets, the stiff-necked people. Aaron was pretty stiff-necked too, if he was helping them make the golden calf. I didn't understand that, how Aaron could get involved in it.
Number one, I don't understand how he got involved, and number two, I don't understand how he kept his position. But I agree. I mean, how Aaron seemed to, he was admonished by Moses, but he seemed to have gotten off pretty lightly.
where did these folks get this gold to make the golden calf? I mean, if they've been struggling in this.
Well, when they left Egypt, if you recall from last time, they got what I would call reparations from the Egyptians. God instructed them to go out and ask their neighbors, their Egyptian neighbors, for gold and silver and cloth, which they got. And apparently they got it in a fairly significant abundance. Yes.
He took their jewelry and melted it down.
Why did the Egyptians give it to them?
Because they wanted to get, they were afraid they were all going to die, given the advance of these plagues. And all the firstborn are killed. I mean, their livestock's been killed. You know, they've had all these plagues. They were afraid the next step was going to be all of them.
They might have made a payment to get them out of Dodge.
Exactly, right. So let's talk a little bit about the 10 commandments. In this, we're not going to go through each one, but I would like to talk to you about a Jewish Torah interpretation of the commandments. The 10 commandments are the first and only example of a covenantal relationship between a deity and an entire people.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm thinking are you gonna talk about the different covenants that we've encountered so far, the Noah?
Well, please go ahead. Yeah.
The covenant with Noah is with all of creation, and that's a covenant with all of
Right.
creation. And with the covenant with Abraham, that is with whoever Abraham's descendants are going to.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Yes.
Interesting.
So, yeah, it is. So remember, this is the third attempt by God to get us all on the right track. Because we had creation, then we had the flood, and now we've got God trying to instill a moral law to get people to give them rules to follow. Unlike other ancient treaties between the ruler and his people, the Ten Commandments focus not only on people's relationship with the ruler, but also on each other's behavior toward each individual. So as we know, it tells us, love your neighbor as yourself. The Ten Commandments treat both religious and social obligations as expressions of divine will. I love this one. 10 Commandments are laws that are simple, absolute, and devoid of qualification. In other words, they were to the point, thou shalt not murder. They contain no abstract moral principles, such as be a good person. It doesn't say that, right? Nearly all the commandments are formulated as prohibitions. There's only one ritual commandment, the Sabbath. That is the only ritual commandment. And the 10 Commandments are formulated in terms of obligations, not rights.
That's important.
Right. I'm sorry.
Say that again.
The 10 Commandments are formulated in terms of obligations, not rights.
Requirements.
Yeah, I know.
From our constitution or.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And the language that we hear put in our public discourse.
Yeah.
About what we owe each other.
Yeah. Each one of the 10 Commandments is singular. It's talking about you. So let's talk, like I say, I'm not going to talk about all the commandments, but I wanted to talk about two. One is the Sabbath. Okay, because the Sabbath, the idea of 7 days a week on the Sabbath day is a creation by God. It wasn't there. It's not like a lunar thing. There's no natural reason that we would follow a 7-day pattern other than that's what God dictated. Anybody got any thoughts on that?
Thought of it that way.
I'm sorry.
I never thought of
Yeah.
it that way. That's
You said other than creation?
I'm sorry. It's God created 7 days. He in Genesis, right?
Right, yeah, so, but that's a pretty big connection.
Right, exactly.
Also the speaking of God speaking
Right,
something into existence.
right.
It's also an enactment of trust. So we can say we trust in God to provide for us.
Right.
But it's another thing to live as if God is going to provide for us, and it's not all about us doing all the work. And
Right.
so this is, it's a liturgical enactment of the belief that God keeps the universe running and we don't have to.
We just have to be good.
Yeah.
So just as an aside, during the French Revolution in the 18th century, they went to a 10-day week because they were trying to get rid of everything, which that lasted about 10 years. So they all killed each other, right? So,
Robert, are you going to speak to the Jewish prediction Saturday versus the Christian?
No.
You're not going
Do you have thoughts on this? Do you have thoughts on that? Do you have thoughts on that? Or?
No, it's
or
just,
interesting to know.
I don't know how we transitioned the Sabbath to us as Sunday and the Sabbath, the Jewish tradition, as you would say the seventh day would be Saturday. So why didn't we celebrate the seventh day as our Sabbath? That was my question, and I don't know.
It's in the scope of my discussion today, because I don't know. I have no idea.
Well, we don't recognize the Sabbath. We recognize the resurrection. And so the Sabbath is the day that Jesus is resting after his crucifixion. And so we celebrate.
That's exactly what I was trying to find out.
I hope it's the right answer.
Thank you.
Okay, so the other thing that's very important to remember is when the commandment for the Sabbath wasn't just for, if you will, the Israelites. It was for their animals. It was for their slaves. And I think it was even for their women. So it was for everybody. That was a joke. No, but it is important that it was for
Yes.
more than just the people. It was for animals. It was for strangers. Okay, you were supposed to treat.
Right, one more question about the commandments. Commandments to love your neighbor as you love yourself, which came later. Is it absent in the Ten Commandments?
It's not stated that way in the Ten Commandments, but the concept of it is.
It's in Deuteronomy, I believe. is
Yeah.
where-
Yeah. Okay,
It's an interpretation in Deuteronomy of the Ten Commandments.
there's in Deuteronomy, the Ten Commandments are restated,
Okay.
but they're a bit different. They're more detailed. They're a little bit more, and we'll talk about that in just a second, but that's a good point. So the Sabbath is an extremely important day, and a lot of people talk about it as a day of rest. That's not the way it's intended. It's supposed to be a holy day. You were supposed to think about and remember God created the world and reflect on what you had done the previous week. And you were supposed to, and the Jews, this is a very important time in Jewish tradition, which they practice even today. It's mainly a family time. It's when you get together and you have dinner and you're not being distracted by all the possible things in this world that can distract us from participating in this holy. It's a holy day.
I've heard it referred to as each Sunday is a little Easter.
Right. Right.
There's a point of interest for those of us that grew up in the fifties.
Our family, we didn't do stuff on Sunday. We went to church, we had a big lunch. We didn't go to the movies. We didn't, it was family time.
There were blue laws. I mean, you couldn't.
That's a great point, John, because I was just thinking the same thing, because on Sunday, everything was closed.
Yeah.
You know,
Remember
excuse me.
Going to the grocery store with on Sunday, but there were aisles that were, covered. They were literally covered.
All the alcohol.
And other things. I don't remember what it was, but yeah. You couldn't buy those.
So the other commandment I wanted to speak a little bit about was the 10th commandment, which is thou shalt not covet. And in the Exodus version and explanation, it says that coveting meant not, if you will, wanting a new car or new house or something that your neighbor had, but actually seeking to take it. It was a kind of a more restrictive of what we think of coveting. In Deuteronomy, it becomes more specific, that it's your thoughts as well. So there is a kind of a difference in the way the commandment of coveting is presented in Exodus and the way it's presented in Deuteronomy.
And that's really interesting because that goes to what saying is that these 10 commandments are very clear but we need some guidance for,
Right.
how to work that out.
So actually, the Torah scholars' interpretation of the way it's presented in Exodus, it was the only commandment that actually regulates thought. What you're thinking. It's kind of interesting.
Say that again.
It's the only commandment that addresses or regulates thought, what you are thinking versus necessarily what you're doing.
And it may be that they were all intended to regulate thought,
Yeah.
as
Well-
Jesus is going to say later on.
Right.
You have heard it say, you shall not commit adultery, but I say to you that anybody who lusts after somebody has committed adultery in his heart. So
All right.
Yeah.
that you're right. I think it was Jimmy Carter. Yeah.
I did say that.
Boy, those were good sayings.
One image that's coming to me, which is another biblical image, is God as a potter and shaping, especially, I can't remember which prophets. But that's sort of that's what these commandments are designed to do, right? They shape us. You know, if we go around coveting, we're gonna end up shaped one way. If we go around and really trying really hard not to covet, we're gonna be shaped a different way. So these are all about shaping us as God's people.
When I think about this and I think about all the religions, the different faiths, you know, it's just absolutely a wonder that we're not all a bunch of blithering idiots. Because the Ten Commandments they can be construed all different ways, and different religions interpret them different ways. And it's fascinating to me, you know, what we believe, and then what someone else, and they're good people, believe so totally different.
Yeah, let's not look at different religions. Let's look at Christians, different denominations. I mean,
Yeah.
we're all reading the same stuff and taking it in wildly different directions.
Right.
Over 30,000. That's about 33,000 or something, Christian denominations.
But if we talk about connections, again, the Ten Commandments carried over into the New Testament and into Christianity. We adopted these pretty much in total, not that we practice them in total, but that we adopt them in total. So that's kind of a interesting connection. We obviously celebrate the Sabbath, maybe not in the same way that the Jews do. One other comment on the Sabbath I read was the Sabbath commandment is unique, and it is the only one of the Ten Commandments for which a reason is given. The reason is to celebrate the creation and God. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
Even though we don't observe with like some Jewish people, there is a big movement in Christian circles to kind of reclaim this practice of observing the Sabbath. So I don't know.
You have to get rid of little league football and baseball.
Yeah.
I mean, that's in our society, that's
Yeah.
a big issue is the other secular things that have encroached on that one day. It's supposed to.
Well, I think that John made the point that we all experienced, given our ancient age, that there was a family element to Sunday when we were young that we don't have now. As a rule, most of us do. Everyone's watching a football game or going to shopping or looking at their phone or whatever the heck they're doing, right?
Well, that they have the grandkids, games.
Right.
And I think when we get in a discussion like this, we are acknowledging that culture comes through and shapes us still. And we, you know, there's a progression and then there's a regression, and it's I'm with Pam. Why aren't we blithering? Or maybe we are.
Maybe we are.
So if you look at the structure of Exodus, it's interesting because the laws are given. And then there's several chapters of practical application about the things how you should treat a situation, like how you should treat a virgin, or how you should react to your neighbor in a certain thing, how you should treat animals, how you should treat possessions. So there's actually, they may seem kind of obtuse to us, but there was a practical application to how these laws might apply, which is kind of interesting. And then the other thing about the structure of Exodus is there are 5 chapters each on the tabernacle. And so I was trying to find some information, and trust me, there's a lot of conflicting information on all of this. But the best explanation I heard was that the first description of the tabernacle was the plans, what they were going to do. Okay. And the second description is actually them doing it. they were executing the plan. And I think all of you have read the great detail that they go into about the tabernacle and how it's built and what materials they are to use. And everything, as we know, has symbols, is symbolic. The lampstands, the altar, the holy place, and then the most holy place. All of this is described in great detail. And if you ever want to look at something interesting, if you go Google the tabernacle, there's actually a video of, they've reconstructed this in Israel, in some wilderness area, exactly like it was to be replicated. So you have the tabernacle, which covered about 1/25 of an acre. I'm sorry, it was not 1/20. It was 1/4 of an acre in space. That was the courtyard area, the altar area, and then the actual tent, which is where we get the tent meeting from, where Moses and God dwelt, if you will.
Can I
And
just-
revivals are now,
I'm sorry.
revivals now.
Yeah, right.
Well, it says how they, when they were traveling, they would pick up the tent and take it with them. And in EFM, we've got a book that shows a picture of the tabernacle. And I don't see how they could take it apart and put it back up all the time.
The
They
whole,
must have.
the whole thing was mobile. They could take it over and they could move it. And the Levites were the only ones that were allowed to, they had responsibility to assemble the temple and to disassemble.
Wow.
And according to one of my sources here, they did it 30 times.
Goodness gracious.
So now remember, they were dwelling in places for a period of time, but the Levites packed it up and unpacked it, assembled it. Except for the first time when Moses is the one that actually installed all of the things inside the temple, like the lampstands and the ark, which I also found interesting when we talked last time about the ark. We have Noah on the ark, and you have the Hebrew name for the basket Moses found in was actually ark. And now you have the Ark of the Covenant, which is where they were going to keep the 10 Commandments. So the other thing about after Moses had broken, you'll have to excuse me for skipping around a bit. After he had broken the first tablets, and he's going to get the second tablets, does anybody have any idea what's a little bit different? They both were. No,
Which his countenance was different after that, was it not?
no, it's
Well, it's a matter of he shaped the tablet,
he being,
Moses.
Right.
The second time,
yeah.
God gave them to him the
Yeah.
first time.
God told Moses to bring the tablets up.
Yeah.
So Moses had to make the tablets.
Yeah.
And then you were gonna say something, Mel?
Oh, no, I was talking about the glow and.
Well, the second time he came down, after he had again spent 40 days on the mountain, that's when his face was shining and the people were afraid of him. So he had to cover his face with a veil when he was in the presence of the people. And then he would take the veil off whenever he was with God. Who else?
One thing just about how Moses is depicted in art.
Mm.
You'll often see him with what look like little horns. And I used to wonder about why is Moses with little horns? But that's meant to look like a light, the shining.
Hmm.
So who else covered their face with a veil? How about Muhammad? You know, Muhammad said he ascended and afterwards he covered his face with a veil. That's why it's prohibited to depict the face of Muhammad in Muslim religion. That's off the track, but anyway. So where are we? Talked about the Sabbath. Now, after all of these experiences, we still have stiff-necked people.
We
They're
do
still-
today.
They're still, they're still, I think it's even stiffer. So Moses is constantly in the struggle between delivering God's word and his laws and the people following them and being stiff-necked. And actually, as you recall, at one time, God is so mad at him, he wants to destroy them. And Moses talks him out of it and gives him reasons. Like, well, one of the reasons was, well, you know, if you destroy all these people, then it will look like the Egyptians were right. And, you know, it would not reflect favorably on you. And there's 2 or 3 other reasons, but any rate, where are we now? If you recall that they said, if you follow my law, you will not be visited by a plague. But they kept breaking the covenant, and ultimately they got visited by a plague. And many of them died. So now here's Joshua again. Joshua had a responsibility when Moses was not at the tent. It was his job to guard it. So other people could not go in. So Joshua was pretty prominent. As a matter of fact, in reading the whole book of Exodus and all, it's kind of interesting how many there's only very few names of people that are mentioned, you know, actually identified. It's kind of, I thought it was interesting.
Yeah.
So we have the whole temple, and, you know, part of the temple tabernacle was the sacrifice to atone for the sins. That was a very important point. And I think the other thing is that if you look at the tabernacle and then you look at the temple that was ultimately built, it's the temple that was built in Jerusalem was much bigger, probably more than twice as big, but it was to the same scale, if you will. Everything is to the exact same scale. And all of the ornaments within the temple were the same. They did have a couple of extra lampstands because I guess they needed the light. But fundamentally, the tabernacle and the temple were the same in terms of the dimensions, I guess. So the other thing is that, and this goes back to connection, Moses both times goes up for 40 days with God. How long did Jesus go? In the wilderness.
40 days and nights.
Super length, right? So. Okay, we talked about the tabernacle being mobile. It was always at the center of the camp. So before they leave Mount Sinai, which they were at for a year, you get into Leviticus. And as we talked about, that's where you get all these specific instructions for priests, what to wear, you know, how to act, what their responsibilities are, which are significant. And actually, Ellen pointed this out to me. The priest robes, at the bottom of the robe of their hem is pomegranates. Okay. And apparently there are 613 seeds in a pomegranate, representing the law. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's kind of a interest. But the idea of that story is that everything was symbolic. Every single thing that they were doing had an incredible amount of symbolism to it, which carries on, right?
Mhm.
So, and again, throughout this whole period of time, all this stuff's going on, these people are still milling around. Sometimes they trust God, sometimes they don't trust God, sometimes they do what they say. So we get to Numbers, and Numbers was when they did the census, again, still in Sinai. And this is where they're getting how they're gonna be organized, set up. To, one tribe's gonna live here, one tribe's gonna live there. It's specified around the temple. And then what their responsibilities of each tribe is gonna be. Things like hygiene and stuff like that are discussed in here. So you can imagine 2 million people living in an area, you would have to have some organization for them to be able to survive, if you will.
And one of my favorite stories in the Old Testament is in Numbers. That's the story of Balaam and his donkey. So if you haven't read that story,
Yeah.
go back and read it. I
Right.
mean, it's just a
Right.
great story.
Yeah. Yep.
Can you think of a city? in American city that would be comparable in that?
Austin,
Austin.
I think Austin,
The
But they're on
metropolitan
top
area
of
must
each-
be somewhere around that.
There's
Yeah.
height, there's not just a plane. But so it's really hard.
yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, you can also ask where'd they get all the resources to do this, to build a tabernacle. I mean, but they were there, right?
It makes me think of just in today's time, about all the migrants.
Yeah.
The different religions, the different.
Yeah.
people, You know, how do you get them all organized? How do you do this? That's gonna have to come back to the qualities. I'm
Yeah.
sorry. Not that anybody else can do it.
No hope.
So after Numbers is Deuteronomy. And I gotta tell you, I didn't spend a lot of time on Deuteronomy because I was exhausted from this other stuff. But in Deuteronomy, fundamentally, Moses is retelling the story. Okay. And number one, when they first get up, they after they leave Mount Sinai, it's about a year they travel up to Kadesh Barnea, which is right across the Jordan River. And this is where they send the 12 spies in to Canaan to scope the place out. And obviously only 2 come back of the 12 that say, hey, we can do this. And the other 10 said, we can't go there. And this upset Moses and God said, well, fine, if you can't go there, none of you are going to go. And we will wait till a new generation has come in before you can go into Canaan. And then they restate the 10 Commandments. This is the second giving of the law, but this time there is more specificity in the law, particularly in the covet law. Now it becomes your thought. It's what you can't think this stuff as well as, takes the next step. So it's just, and there's more detail on the Sabbath itself as well. So
Rod, I
That-
think you're amazing.
that's
This
the-
level of
this is the
scholarship.
This is the Torah in 1 hour.
It's amazing. I want to thank you. Look at this.
Yes,
Anyway,
thank you very much, Rob.
wow.
One thing that I thought of, one of the focus questions at the end of the chapter had to do with Moses not being allowed to get into the
Right,
promised land and what that made
right.
me think of. And then that reminded me of Martin Luther King's last speech, which some of y'all may know, I guess the night before he was actually assassinated.
Yeah.
He said, like
Yes.
anybody, I would like to live a long life, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he has allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. And that just kills me every time.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. Just that imagery.
Another link.
Yeah. go ahead.
I always I like to add the humor in some of these stories. I say when the EFM's people have heard this a couple of times, but I said Moses was looking at all these people gathering and agitated and complaining, getting ready to cross the Jordan River and he looked down on it and God said, you can't go, but you can see it. He turned to walk down the path and he said, free at last. Free at last. Thank God Almighty, I'm free at last. And then he said, I didn't want this damn job in the first place.
Well, he couldn't go over because when they wanted water, God told him to speak to the rock. And he struck it with the staff and said, we will call for it. And there was this undercurrent of the fact that the people were looking on Moses as a God himself. So God does say, I'm a jealous God. So he didn't allow him to go in for violating that rule.
My sense is that 40 years later, after they started this, Moses had some years on him before he started. So that's 2 generations have come. So the 3rd generation was just being born. So it's a young people's game at that time. And
Well,
like you said, Moses might have said, that's a good thing. I'll just stay on that side.
But this, he turned over the leadership to Joshua. And I found it interesting. I had never realized that Joshua had been with him in such a significant role side by side with him throughout all his time. And
And there's something in there about Moses putting his hands on Joshua.
yes,
And that's the apostolic passing of that to the next.
good point. Yes,
generation.
that's true.
Very powerful.
Yeah, it is.
Also, with regard to the importance of the book of Deuteronomy, we think of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount as being modeled largely after the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. I think as much as that, it's modeled after Deuteronomy and Moses kind of
Great point,
speech on the plains of Moab and kind of reminding the people of the law and kind of reinterpreting it. So I think it's actually a very important book in that regard.
Yeah.
The other thing that strikes me is that from the time it's happening, and I'm not sure what year it was, but probably 1600 years ago when the traditions that were established in the Torah have gone down through all the way to today, particularly with the Jewish culture, and much of our culture is based on traditions set at this time.
Right. I mean, you can look at our own sanctuary and look at the symbolism in there, the light, the candle, and the way the altar.
So traditions are very, very important.
Yes. Thank you.
You did a
Thank
great
you.
job, Rob. I think we'll make you just the leader of the general. You will. More than me.
Thank you, Rod.
Nobody's there.
Thank you.